The next thing we're going to cover, and the final thing that we're going to cover, is talking about what happens when you get released from the station and like the post-arrest process. So what happens after you get arrested? You won't be able to see it on here. We can't see it on here either. But this is like a flow chart that was made by someone who's kind of gone through the process of being like arrested, going to court, and all that stuff that follows an arrest. You can find it on the Informed Dissent website. And yeah, it's basically, or you might be able to zoom in. I'm not really able to tell, but yeah, it's on the website. And it just, we put it in here just to show you that it's not just like arrest and nothing else. It goes from an arrest, it goes through to all this other stuff that happens after your arrest. So just getting arrested isn't just getting arrested, it's getting arrested and going through all this stuff afterwards. So yeah, that's just to inform people that it's not as straightforward as it seems. Some quick terminology. It's fine if you don't remember all of this, but it's just good to be able to refer back to it, I guess. So the first one is arrested. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that it's what happens on the street kind of thing. So the police might suspect you of committing an offence. And then they use that suspicion to then arrest you and take you to a police station. And yeah, and the interview and all that stuff that happens that we just talked about. The next piece of terminology is being charged, which we've said a few times now. But what it means is when you get arrested, there's like an offence that's kind of linked to you, I guess. But being charged means like being given a court date almost. So you get a court date, you go to court. That's the process of being charged. Sometimes this happens like when you get released from the station, and sometimes it can happen months or even in some cases years after you get arrested. So yeah, that just goes to show the length of it all. Being convicted is where you get found guilty in court of a crime by a court of law. That's what it means. What happens after that is being sentenced. That's being given your punishment in that case. Punishment's not the official word, that's why it was punishment. And the final thing is the CPS. I think we might have mentioned this earlier, but CPS stands for Crown Prosecution Service. They're the people who kind of like work with the police, and they're the lawyers who kind of decide whether you should be charged and whether you should be taken to court. So yeah, they'll be the ones in court usually who are prosecuting you. And yeah, do you want to do the next bit?
Okay, so how much can an arrest cost you? The costs that can be imposed on you by the court. So if you plead guilty or if you're found guilty by the court, they can impose some different types of costs, court costs, and also possibly a victim surcharge, as well as potentially a fine. Travel costs. So typically you may expect to visit solicitors, although these days it might be perhaps done by Zoom. And also potentially 2 to 3 trips to court if you plead not guilty. So prepare yourself for some travel costs. If you're found not guilty by the court, you can reclaim your travel costs from the court. So make sure you keep your receipts. And in cases of financial hardship, the XR legal support team may be able to cover your travel costs to court. Solicitor's fees, if you would like to be represented, so you can represent yourself. If you would like to be represented by a solicitor, you may be eligible for legal aid. Your solicitor can make an application to the legal aid agency to check your eligibility. If you're not eligible for legal aid, then you may have to pay solicitor's fees yourself if you choose to be represented. It can obviously cost you time in dealing with solicitors and in attending court and travel time. loss of earnings if you have to take time out of work to do all those things, and possibly also additional childcare costs. Okay, thinking about a situation where people are arrested on multiple occasions. So there are consequences for people who are arrested more than once. There's a higher risk of being held on remand at the police station after arrest, so not being granted bail. Less likely to be bailed by the courts, and therefore a higher risk of being held on remand post-plea hearing. Previous offences will be taken into account in sentencing, so repeat offenders are likely to get higher sentences, and also higher sentences for offences which are committed while on bail. And also, if you have an active conditional discharge for a first offence, a conditional discharge is a type of non-custodial sentence. So if the sentence that you're given, if you're found guilty of an offence, is a conditional discharge, and that is still active, hasn't expired yet, you risk being resentenced for the first offence if you're arrested for a second offence. Okay, and looking at the potential consequences of conviction. So there are many different types of consequences if you're convicted of a crime, and these are only a few. Everyone copes with arrest and conviction in different ways. None of the ways are wrong, and we must accept that everyone deals with arrest differently. Some consequences are psychological, so it can be stressful going through the process of waiting for trial and the unsure sort of uncertainty of whether you'll be convicted or not. Mortgage and insurance. So you typically car and house and business insurance will ask you if you have any criminal convictions when you apply. You only need to declare unspent convictions. So how this affects your application can vary with different providers and different types of insurance. Typically, with car and house insurance, they should not be affected by the types of offence that we've talked about in this training. However, it could result in higher premiums, or in some cases being refused insurance. Insurance for minibuses and public service vehicles could be affected, so those and these types of professions would be advised to check. And business insurance can be affected if directors have a criminal record. University and education. So universities may ask you to disclose your criminal record if you want to enrol for a degree, especially for areas such as nursing and teaching. So there may be greater impacts for non-UK nationals, and you can look at informed dissent. There's pages on arrest and immigration status. So if you're not a UK national, it's really important to go away and look at that and understand how it can affect your rights to reside in the UK. DBS checks. So depending on what your job or your chosen career is, having a conviction can affect these. Typically in an XR context, most of the offences that people might be convicted of become spent after a certain amount of time, typically 1 year, depending on the severity of the sentence. Once they're spent, they will not appear on a basic or standard DBS, which stands for Disclosure and Barring Service check. However, for some jobs, including working with children or vulnerable adults, as well as healthcare, it's necessary to have an enhanced DBS check for those types of employment. And on an enhanced DBS check, spent convictions do still show up. And it can also affect travel and visas, which you can also read more about on Informed Dissent. There's a page about travelling abroad.